The night was so cold that even the stars seemed brittle, sharp points in a sky the color of iron. Snow creaked under its own weight, shifting and sighing as though the forest itself was restless. And at the edge of a clearing, bound against the trunk of an ancient pine, a girl trembled. The chains had been fastened so tightly around her wrists and ankles that they cut into her skin. Metal against flesh in the dead of winter was a punishment worse than death itself. Every link burned like fire, then froze into numbness until she could no longer tell if her hands were still there. Her breath clouded before her face, thin and ragged, like smoke rising from a dying fire. She did not remember how long they had left her here, hours, a day. The memory of her captor's laughter still rang in her ears. Men who had found amusement in her suffering, who thought chaining her to a tree in the frozen woods was a kind of sport. Their boots had crunched off into the distance, leaving her alone with the wolves and the cold. The girl leaned her head back against the rough bark. Each exhale came with a small whimper she could not hold back. "Please," she whispered into the empty woods. "Please, someone." But her voice was swallowed by the silence of the snow. Far off, the sound of footsteps broke that silence. Not the quick, careless steps of men mocking her, but the slow, deliberate tread of someone moving carefully through the drifts. She stiffened, fear curling through her chest. Had they come back to finish what they started? The shadow appeared first between the trees, a tall figure, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat of wool and fur, a hat pulled low against the cold, a rifle slung across his back. He moved with the patience of a man who had spent his life in the wilderness, who knew how to listen to the woods instead of fight them. The girl tried to cry out, but her thee throat was too dry. Only a broken rasp escaped her lips. Still, it was enough. The stranger's head turned, and his eyes fixed on her where she shivered against the pine. He came closer, his boots crunching through the frost. The girl saw the beard heavy with frost, the hard lines of his face made harsher by the moonlight. Yet his gaze softened when it landed on the chains biting into her skin. "My God," the mountain man muttered, voice low, hoarse from disuse. He dropped to one knee in front of her, his gloved hands reaching for the iron. He tugged at it, testing the strength, his brow furrowed when the links held. The girl whimpered again, tears spilling down her cheeks only to freeze on her skin. "Please," she managed, the word breaking apart in the cold. "Hold on," he said, steady, like the voice of someone who had seen too much suffering to waste time with panic. His hands went to the small axe at his belt. The clang of metal striking iron rang sharp through the woods. Once, twice, each blow echoed, startling the crows from their branches. Sparks danced briefly in the night, and then, at last, one of the shackles split open, the broken chain falling useless into the snow. Her freed wrist dropped into his waiting hand. He caught it gently, as though he feared he might hurt her more if he wasn't careful. His thumb brushed the angry red welt left by the shackle, then he worked on the next. By the time the final link fell away, the girl collapsed forward, too weak to hold herself up. He caught her against his chest, the weight of her slight and trembling form barely anything to him. "You're safe now," the mountain man whispered, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders as though he could will his own warmth into her bones. "They won't leave you here to die, not while I'm breathing." And as he lifted her into his arms, the forest closed in again, silent but watchful, as though it too knew the balance of mercy had just shifted. The snow had thickened since he found her, falling in soft sheets that blurred the world into shadow and silver. The mountain man's breath came in steady plumes as he carried her, her head resting weakly against his shoulder, her body trembling even beneath his heavy coat. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. Starvation, cold and fear had hollowed her frame. He could feel the jut of her bones through the furs, the fragility of her body as though she were a bird with broken wings. Each step he took sank deep into the drifts, but he didn't falter. He was used to the wilderness demanding his strength. Tonight, though, it demanded more than muscle. Tonight, it demanded mercy. Her lips moved faintly against his chest. He bent his head to hear. "Why? Why did you stop?" Her voice was faint, barely a thread of sound. he answered without hesitation. Because you were there. The girl's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion pulling her under, but he kept speaking to her anyway. Sometimes words were as much a shield as fire. I've seen traps laid for wolves, he muttered. But no wolf deserves what they did to you, and no man leaves another soul chained to the cold. The wind picked up, swirling sharp ice through the trees. He leaned forward into it, cradling her tighter, his chin resting atop her hair. He could feel the frost still clinging to her strands, brittle as straw. He remembered storms like this breaking lesser men. Tonight, he would not break. At last, through the haze of snow, his cabin appeared, a low structure built from logs and stone, half buried by drifts. Smoke curling faintly from the chimney where the fire he'd left smoldering still fought to live. He trudged up to the door, shouldered it open, and the warmth rushed out in a wave of blessed relief. Inside, the glow of embers painted the room in hues of red and gold. He lowered her carefully onto a pallet by the hearth, close enough that the heat would reach her, but not so close the shock of it would burn her frozen skin. He shivered violently now, her body shaking as though trying to drive the cold out on its own. He knew that meant life still fought inside her. Good, that was something he could work with. Kneeling beside her, he pulled back the coat, revealing her raw wrists and ankles. The sight made his jaw tighten. Deep grooves circled her skin, the flesh swollen, bruised. In places blood had frozen in thin crusts. He touched one gently with his calloused fingers, and she flinched. Easy, he murmured. I won't hurt you. From a shelf he fetched a small tin of salve, something he'd made from pine resin and bear fat. It smelled sharp like the woods after rain. He dipped his fingers into it, then began to rub it carefully into her wounds. She hissed, but he kept steady, his touch light. When he was done with her wrists and ankles, he wrapped them in strips of clean cloth torn from an old shirt. Then he laid a fur blanket over her small frame. Her eyes opened a crack. The firelight reflected in them, wide and uncertain. "Why?" she whispered again, voice hoarse. "Why are you helping me?" He sat back on his heels, silent for a moment, his own gaze fixed on the fire. Finally, he spoke. "Because somebody should have stopped them. And if nobody else will, then it's me." The girl blinked slowly, her lashes heavy with exhaustion. Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes before sliding down into her hairline. She turned her face slightly toward the flames, soaking in their warmth, as though she'd never known fire before. The mountain man stayed there, cross-legged beside her, tending the fire higher until it roared bright, filling the cabin with heat. He didn't move to his bed or the chair in the corner. He remained by her side, a silent sentinel in the red glow. And though the storm outside howled like a wild beast, inside there was only the crackle of fire, the steady sound of her breathing and his vow, unspoken but carved deep into him like scars, that she would not be left alone in the cold again. Morning broke pale and quiet over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried under white silence. Snowdrifts pressed high against the cabin walls, and icicles hung from the roof, catching the faint glow of a winter sun. Inside, the fire still burned, steady and low, filling the room with its warmth. The mountain man stirred it with the poker, coaxing a few sparks to life, then set a pot of snow on the iron hook to melt. The scent of wood smoke and pine resin lingered in the air. Behind him, a rustle came from the pallet. The girl stirred, her eyes opening slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar room. She stiffened instantly, pulling the blanket tighter around her as though bracing for pain. Her gaze darted across the log walls, the fire, the man crouched near it. "You're awake," he said softly, without turning yet. His voice carried no demand, only simple fact. Her throat worked as she swallowed. Where am I?" "My cabin," he replied. "The storm's done with, but it would have taken you if I hadn't pulled you out." He finally turned toward her, his eyes steady, kind but not prying. "You're safe here." She hugged the fur closer, her small hands trembling against the thick pelt. "Safe," she whispered, as if the word itself was strange to her tongue. The man poured steaming water into a tin cup, then dropped in a handful of dried herbs he kept in a pouch. The smell of mint and wild chamomile filled the air. He carried it over and crouched beside her, holding the cup out. "Drink, it'll warm you." Her eyes flicked to his hands, large, scarred, strong enough to break iron, yet careful now, steady as he waited. She hesitated, but the rising steam called to her. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the cup. The heat seeped into her palms, and when she sipped, the warmth slid through her throat and down into the coldest parts of her. Tears stung her eyes, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was because no one had ever given her something so simple, warmth without a price. "You should eat too," he said, moving back toward the hearth. He ladled stew from a pot that had simmered through the night, beans, venison, and root vegetables he'd stored before the snow came. When he brought the wooden bowl to her, she stared at it as though it were a miracle. She lifted the spoon, her hand trembling so badly she nearly spilled it. He saw it, and quietly set his big hand beneath hers, steadying the bowl without a word. She ate, slowly at first, then faster, hunger overtaking fear. When at last she set the empty bowl aside, color had returned faintly to her cheeks. She glanced up at him then, studying him in the shifting glow of firelight. His hair was dark with strands of grey, his beard thick, his eyes the clear blue of winter skies. He was not young, nor polished like men she remembered from before, but there was something steady in him, something that made her want to breathe easier. "Why? Why did you break the chains?" she asked at last, her voice raw. He leaned back, resting one arm on his knee. "Because they didn't belong on you." Her lips parted, a protest rising, but she couldn't speak it. She lowered her gaze to her bandaged wrists instead. The skin throbbed, but it no longer burned like fire. The cabin settled into quiet again. He didn't press her with questions, though he could see the shadows lingering in her eyes. He knew better than to demand her story before she was ready. Some wounds needed silence before words. At last he rose and moved to the window. The storm had left the world blank and clean, the trees heavy with snow, no tracks but his own leading to the door. "Snow's deep, roads are gone for now," he said. "No one will find you here, not unless you want them to." She stared at him, that last sentence echoing in her chest. "Not unless you want them to." It was the first time anyone had given her a choice. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body still fragile but her breathing steadier. "Now." The fire crackled, the man turned back toward her, and for the first time since the chains had closed around her wrists, she believed she might live another day. The mountain man moved about the cabin with an ease that came from years of solitude. His boots made soft thuds against the plank floor as he chopped kindling, checked the rifle by the door, and brushed snow from his coat. The girl watched him through lowered lashes, the fur still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Every so often he'd glance at her, not to question, but to make sure she hadn't drifted into the shadows again. He knew the look of someone lost too long to fear. At length, she found her voice. "You live here alone?" He nodded. "Been near 10 winters since I saw another man within these walls. Company's scarce this far up. That suits me." She traced the rim of the tin cup with one finger, her voice barely audible. "Alone? Must be lonely." He gave a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes, but better lonely than tied in chains." Her hand stilled. The fire cracked loud in the silence. She pulled the blanket tighter as though to guard herself from the memory that rose sharp and hot. He noticed. He didn't press. Instead, he sat down across from her, setting an apple on the table between them. He split it clean with his knife, sliding half across to her. "Eat. It helps." She hesitated, then took it, biting into the crisp fruit. Juice ran down her lip, and she wiped it away quickly, embarrassed. But he only looked at her calmly, as if there was nothing shameful in hunger. For a while they ate in silence. The storm outside groaned against the roof, but the fire held steady, wrapping the room in warmth. At last, she whispered, "They said I stole." The words seemed to shock even her, tumbling out too quickly, her breath catching as if she'd broken some vow of silence. "He didn't move." "And did you?" Her gaze lifted sharply, a flash of pride in her eyes. "No." Then it faltered, softening to a whisper. "But what does truth matter when no one will listen?" He studied her then, the hollows in her cheeks, the lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She couldn't have seen more than 20 winters, yet her voice carried the weariness of someone twice that. "They tied me to that tree," she said, her words tumbling out now like water breaking through a dam. "They left me there when the snow came down, said if I froze, it was God's justice." Her throat closed and she pressed her lips shut, shaking. He didn't speak right away. He only rose, crossed the cabin, and took the kettle off the hook before it boiled dry. He poured her another cup, set it before her hands. Finally, he said, "Sounds to me like their justice is just cruelty in a holy cloak." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken of it that way. No one had ever dared. She stared at him, searching his face for judgment, but found only steadiness. His eyes didn't shift away, didn't narrow with suspicion. He sat across from her as if her broken words were enough. Her shoulders shook, and tears slipped down her cheeks. She turned her face away, ashamed of them, but he only reached for the quilt hanging by the hearth and laid it gently over her shoulders. "Rest," he said. "There'll be time for more, when you've strength to tell it." The kindness in his voice pierced deeper than the cold ever had. She curled under the quilt, her breath hitching. The fire burned low, and outside the snow thickened against the window. In the hush of that cabin, with the storm pressing close, she let her eyes close. Not from fear this time, but from the first hint of safety she had felt in years. The mountain man sat watch, rifle across his knees, as the storm raged on. He knew the world outside was wide and merciless, but as long as she was under his roof, the chains of ice and iron would not touch her again. The storm raged through the night, tearing at the cabin like a living thing. The girl slept in fits, waking at every howl of wind, every creak in the timbers. Each time she found the mountain man by the fire, his broad frame still and watchful, eyes fixed on the door as if daring the storm to enter. When dawn finally broke, pale and weak through the shutters, the world lay buried in white. Silence stretched over the valley, heavy and complete. She stirred beneath the quilt, her face flushed from warmth instead of cold. For the first time since he'd found her, her body did not tremble. The mountain man poured her a little broth from the pot. "Drink," he said. "The storm's past, but something tells me trouble hasn't." Her brow furrowed, but she obeyed, sipping carefully. Then she froze, the tin cup halfway to her lips. From outside, beneath the stillness, came a sound that did not belong. The crunch of boots in the snow. The mountain man had heard it too. He set his cup down without a sound, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the hearth. His eyes flicked to hers, and she saw something there, not panic, but a hard readiness. Her breath came fast. "They'll be looking," she whispered. "They'll come back for me." "Not while I'm standing," he muttered. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. His jaw tightened. Dark figures moved between the trees, 5, maybe 6 of them, cloaked in furs, rifles across their shoulders. They were spreading out, careful, methodical, men who knew how to track in the deep snow. The girl's face drained of color. "They chained me because I spoke," she whispered, as if the walls themselves might carry her voice back to them. Said silence was the law. Said a woman who questioned was a danger. Her voice cracked. "If they find me..." The mountain man cut her off, his tone steady as stone. "Then they'll wish the blizzard had finished the job. Stay low. Keep to the back of the room." She obeyed, slipping down behind the bed frame, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they'd hear it through the walls. The mountain man moved with quiet precision, checking the rifle, laying fresh logs on the fire so smoke would keep curling from the chimney, so the cabin looked lived in, not abandoned. He didn't bar the door. A barred door was a frightened man's door. He left it as it was, only loading a second pistol and tucking it into his belt. Outside, the crunching grew nearer. Voices drifted through the snow, low, cold, searching. Tracks lead this way. Reckon he's hiding her. Old trapper thinks he can cross us. The girl pressed her hand over her mouth to smother a sob. The mountain man crouched by the window, watching. His mind was steady, his breath even. This wasn't the first time the lawless had come knocking, but this time, it wasn't his life alone he was guarding. He spoke low, so only she could hear. "Whatever happens, don't come out. Not till I tell you. Understand?" She nodded, clutching the quilt so tightly her knuckles whitened. The footsteps stopped just outside. For a moment there was only silence and the sharp hiss of her breath. Then, a fist pounded against the cabin door. "Open up, old man. You got something that don't belong to you." The mountain man rose to his full height, the rifle steady in his hands. He looked at the girl once, her wide eyes, her face pale as snow, and gave a slow, sure nod. Then he stepped to the door. "Careful," he muttered under his breath. "Careful how you ask." And with that, he lifted the latch. The storm outside had passed, but another storm was waiting to break at his doorstep. The door creaked open, and a blast of icy air swept into the cabin. The girl shrank further into the corner, clutching the quilt up to her chin. The mountain man filled the doorway like a wall of stone. Behind him, the snow-laden world stretched pale and silent, except for the men standing in a rough half-circle just beyond the porch. 5 of them, rough-bearded, rifles slung loose, eyes cold as the frost on their coats. The leader stepped forward, his boots crunching through the drift. He had a scar across his jaw and a sneer that seemed carved there permanent. "You've got something of ours," he said, voice carrying over the snow. The mountain man didn't blink. "Got a fire, got a roof. Nothing here's yours." The scarred man chuckled. "Don't play dumb, trapper. We know you found her. She's marked. Belongs to us." A silence hung between them, broken only by the wind tugging at the pines. Inside, the girl buried her face in her hands, whispering to herself, "Please don't let them take me back. Please." The mountain man's jaw worked once before he spoke. "Ain't no man owns a woman. You left her to die. She's under my roof now." The sneer turned sharp, ugly. "Then you'll die with her." At his nod, the men shifted, rifles unslinging. The air thickened, heavy with the kind of moment that only ends one way. The mountain man raised his rifle slow, steady as the rising sun. His voice cut through the cold like an axe. "I buried men for less than come into my door uninvited. You want her, you'll have to step through me, and I don't reckon you'll walk out." The scarred man's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough. He spat into the snow. So be it. Time bent. Breath hung white between teeth. Fingers curled on triggers. Then, the first shot cracked the stillness, echoing through the valley. The girl screamed, pressing herself flat to the floor as smoke filled the cabin. The mountain man's rifle boomed, sending a spray of snow and splinters into the air. One of the figures outside staggered back, clutching his shoulder before collapsing into the drift. Chaos erupted. Bullets ripped through the thin wood of the cabin walls, whistling past the girl's ear, slamming into the table and sending the pot of broth crashing to the floor. She crawled beneath the bed, trembling, whispering the only prayer she knew. The mountain man didn't flinch. He moved with brutal precision, firing, reloading, ducking behind the doorframe. Each crack of his rifle was followed by a grunt, a curse, or the heavy thud of a body falling into the snow. Outside, the scarred man roared orders, his voice raw. "Smoke him out! Burn it if you have to!" The girl's heart seized. Fire. Not again. Not after everything. But before the men could act, the mountain man's second pistol barked. Another attacker dropped into the snow. Then silence fell again, heavy, broken only by the wind. 2 men left. She could hear them moving, circling wide, trying to flank. The mountain man slammed the door shut, reloading with calm hands. His eyes cut to her hiding place. "Stay down." She nodded, clutching the quilt so hard her fingers ached. The door shuddered as another shot hit it. Snow sifted down from the rafters. The mountain man leaned close to the wall, listening. His face was carved from granite, but his eyes burned. He knew they weren't finished, and neither was he.